Bob asked me here to come speak on what unites us as Americans and what makes us all Americans. And to be an American, you don't have to belong to the right family. You don't even have to be born in this country. Really, to be American comes down to one thing. The thing that unites us as Americans, it's not really the land where we live. It's certainly not the color of our skin or even the extraordinary power of our armies. It's not even the beauty of our flag. What makes us American is our ideas and our values. You know, you've heard people say that such and such a thing is un-American. Now, there's no equivalent expression in other countries. There's no such thing as being un-French or un-Italian. And what un-American means is that people have the wrong civic values and ideals. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what our values and ideals are, and particularly what makes us Americans is our history and the refusal of our founders to be subject to big government. So let me talk just a little bit about our history, and to do that I need to talk a little bit about world history. And you've seen that movie, right? The History of the World, Part 1? I don't know if you're familiar with that. You may remember in that movie was partially about a king. And in that movie, the king could do anything he wanted. He spent his time, shooting peasants and molesting the maidservants and, in general, telling everybody what to do. And if you remember seeing that movie, every time he exercised his royal powers, he'd always say, "It's good to be the king." Do you remember that? Yeah. Now, after about 1,000 years ago, just about the most important development in Western political history took place. It was called the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta was a record of the meeting between the king and the nobles. The nobles were so frustrated with the way the king kept raising taxes that the nobles rode up to the king's castle with all their armies, and they gave the king the document. And the document says basically, even though you're the king, your powers are limited. You can't just do everything you want to do anymore. You have to sign this agreement. It's called the Magna Carta, and it limits your powers. Because the nobles realized it's good to be the king, but it's not so good to be one of the king's subjects.
Yeah!
Now the king signed the Magna Carta, and the nobles rode off, content in the knowledge that they had limited the powers of government. And upon their departure, the king immediately said, this agreement, I was coerced, it was against my will, I signed the Magna Carta against my will, my royal lawyers tell me that this agreement is null and void and non-binding, and I'm king, you're not the boss of me, I can do anything I want to, because I'm the king. And I guess that's just the way kings are. And the damage was done, though. And eventually, it came to be understood that the authority of the government was limited and bound by the law, one of the great contributions of English culture to the history of civilization. And several hundred years later, it was left to the founders to ask what I call the next question. Here it is. I understand that the king is limited by the law, but the next question is, why do we need to have a king at all? And that's the question posed by the Declaration of Independence, which was the revolutionary document that was created because of the intercontinental oppression of the American states by the British Crown. And if you look at the Declaration, you can see that once again, it's good to be the king, but it's not so great to be the king's subjects. Once again, the king is abusing the authority that he has. And I'll just read you this from the Declaration. He's erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. And indeed, the Declaration goes on to say that he has imposed taxes on us without our consent. And apparently it's a frequent theme of history that people have the audacity to object to the taxes that the king lays on them. And if you'll permit me, I'll read you just one more part from the Declaration. It says, because we're breaking ties with the king, we have a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, and so it's required that we should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The document says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundations on organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their happiness.
How did you vote? I got a question.
The document then lists what it calls a long train of abuses that demonstrate the way the king has abused his own power. And it ends with what I think is the most unforgettable language ever used by the framers. The signers were aware that by signing this declaration, they might be signing their own death warrant. And so, the signers of the declaration closed by saying, to honor this, we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And you know, the founders went on to write the Constitution, and they were so aware of the dangers of big government. They did something new. They said, we're going to split the government into a whole bunch of different parts. Each part only has a few powers, and if the power isn't mentioned in the Constitution, then the government can't do it. And you know, you can read the Constitution. It's very short. It's shorter than some of the books I read my kids at night, and you can see it's designed to protect the rights of every American, not just the powers of the government. And pardon me for this history lesson, which is what I guess you get when you elect a teacher.
Yeah, it's a politician hiding behind the Constitution, isn't it?
Well, I'll tell you.
That is?
Now we're going to get to my favorite part of the Constitution, which is where we talk about the ideas and values that make us all Americans, the ideas and values that have lasted for centuries and that have inspired the world. If you take a look at the Bill of Rights, you know what it says? The very first part of it says we have the right to speak to each other, to assemble like we're doing here today. We got the right to print out our ideas on printing presses or even on computers. We can peaceably assemble, and even says the government should not take sides in religious disputes. And this is an amazing thing. If you look at what's happening on the other side of the world, in Iran, you can see where people are being arrested just because they're speaking and just because they're assembling. And that's the way it's been for most of history in most of the world. And the Constitution says we don't have a king, we don't have an Ayatollah, all we got is a First Amendment. If you want to speak, it doesn't matter if you're wearing a suit, it doesn't matter if you don't own a suit. You can say whatever you want. Go ahead.
Okay, politicians hijacking the Tea Party movement. Politicians hijacking the Tea Party movement.
That's what the First Amendment is for. You know what the Second Amendment's for? The Second Amendment is when the government forgets about the First Amendment. The Second Amendment is about how we the people, not the king, and not the government, are the first and last source of moral and political authority. And the Fourth Amendment says that no king and no government can just bust in our house and start going through our stuff. It says we got a right to be secure in our houses, in our persons. It says no king can mess with us. It says we're all kings and queens in our own house. Now, if you keep on reading the Fifth and Sixth and Seventh Amendments, you can see the things the kings kept on doing to oppress the people. And it used to be that if the king didn't like you, he'd just get you thrown in prison. Did you know that the kings would put their enemies on trial? And if you were found not guilty at the trial, then the king would just put you on trial for the same offense again and again. This says he can't do that anymore.
All right.
Ramos and Campion! Ramos and Campion were political prisoners!
The Constitution says that if you get arrested, the cops have to have reason to believe that you did something wrong. They can't just arrest you because they don't like the way you look or because of the color of your skin. The Constitution says if you get put on trial, then the court has to follow the law, treat everybody fairly. And the Constitution says that if the prosecutor and judge think that you're guilty, that's not enough. That means the Constitution says you got to convince 12 people, a jury, to think that you're guilty as well, and the defendants have the right to confront their accuser, and they even have the right to a lawyer. And maybe the most important parts of the Bill of Rights are the 9th and 10th Amendments. And I saw a gentleman holding up a sign in favor of the 9th and 10th Amendments. And you know what they say? The 9th and 10th Amendments say that this list of the Bill of Rights, this is not a complete list. We've listed some of your rights, but don't interpret this list as being complete, because this Bill of Rights is only the beginning of our freedoms.